Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In recognition of Banned Books Week, September 22nd through 28th, we are launching our first ILV book club with a series of short discussions of James LaRue's book entitled On Censorship, A Public Librarian Examines Cancel Culture in the U.S. The book is a combination of personal reflection and a deep dive into the specifics of book banning. James LaRue will join us for a live stream on October 2nd. In the meantime, read On Censorship with ILV Fellows Elizabeth Spivak and Pamela Hayes Bohannon. We begin our discussion with the first half of Part 1, which is entitled The Role of the Library. If you are following along, read the sections My Censored Life through the end of the section labeled Why People Challenge Library Resources. Remember to join us for the live meeting with James LaRue on October 2nd at 7 p.m. Eastern. You will find the link in the show notes, and you can find out more by going to ilvalues.org. Hey, hello. Welcome to the inaugural episode of a book club for ILV. And Pam Hayes Bohannon, now retired librarian, academic librarian, has agreed to join me for this little short series. And we chose a book on censorship, very appropriate to things that we've talked about before. And actually, I should, even though I should say that it is, the book is called On Censorship, A Public Librarian Examines Cancel Culture in the U.S. by James LaRue. So as we start, he starts the very first section. He says, I wish I didn't have so much experience with censorship issues. Good to, call me Ishmael. I thought that was it was like, oh, I'm sorry, and I feel that way about you a lot of times. I feel like I need to say, I'm sorry, Pam. I'm sorry you have to put up with this. And he is talking about, in these first few pages, his personal experience with, with book banning and stuff. And he's talking about maybe like 10 per year. And while that's a bummer, manageable, and that they have a process for it. And I know that you've talked about this before too, right? That there's a process that people need to go through. They shouldn't just come up to the desk and say, this book, waive the book. This book should be banned, right?
Right. And I'm also trying to think, this is something I've always said when I talk about censorship is libraries should always have something in place. And now it's almost like naive to think that that's good enough, right? Like, because people are coming with hundreds of books at a time that they want to. I saw one news story, I think it was in Florida, where this gentleman had a whole team of people just filling out these little index cards to, ban every book that he saw on a list that somebody told him to ban. And every single, one, it said, why do you want this banned? To protect children. They just put that example on or that reason on for every single one.
If you're going to ban a book, you should read the book, I think. if you want to, Now, I had never heard of the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom. So he says that he worked there for a couple of years. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you have any enlightening comments about the Office for Intellectual Freedom. It sounds awesome.
Right. So, I mean, that's the place where you would go to find out, like, I think he said in here even, like, that it's like the most visited spot where people go to look at the most banned books for the year. That's where you can find information about what books are banning, why people are banning them. And they do sponsor the Banned Books Week every year in the fall. This is the Office of Intellectual Freedom.
You and I both loved this little anecdote about Brussels sprouts.
So I did really think he made an excellent analogy with going to the grocery store, and why does he have to see Brussels sprouts when he gets to the grocery store? He's offended by Brussels sprouts, and he gives a whole story about growing up and how awful Brussels sprouts are. And he talks to the manager, who's a friend of his, and the manager's response is, nobody comes to the grocery store because it doesn't have what they don't want. And then he added, some people like Brussels sprouts. Right? So this is the thing. The library does have something for everyone, but has stuff you don't like. That's not there for you. It's not for you. But there is something there for you. And if not, you should let them know.
Right.
You should let the library know that it doesn't have what you don't want, what you do want. It doesn't have what you do want. And that was another part of the book, was about programming and stuff. Well, I don't like this program about Drag Queen Story Hour. Well, what program do you want? We're
right.
we're not we don't necessarily want to cancel this program, but you don't have to go. Nobody's making you go.
That's right.
But please tell us what programming you would like, and we'll see if we can maybe arrange that. The library is there for everyone.
And I also liked, a little bit later in the chapter, he says, libraries don't buy books in order to offend someone.
Right. I highlighted that section.
You did.
Oh,
yeah. I mean,
don't buy them in order to offend. I often think about this. One of the things he says right before the Brussels sprouts analogy, he says, he mentions the self-centered perspective, the idea that one's own perspective is more important, more correct than anyone else's. And I really do see this kind of paternalistic reasoning behind a lot of challenges. And that's definitely coming from both sides. We hear a lot about challenges coming from the right, and there's no doubt that is where the vast majority are coming from. But that is not to say that they don't come from the left. And I think in both cases, it's really this very paternalistic viewpoint that, well, I can read this book, and I can handle it. I can handle what's in it, and I can determine for someone else whether or not they can handle it. That's just so beyond paternalistic.
I was just reading
their own decisions.
Just yesterday, I was reading an article, and they found that on the left, on the left, and the right, both were concerned about were concerned with social justice issues. Like, both cared about social justice, right? They cared about being kind to others. So all these values that they had in common. But the people more, not the extreme right, but the more center right people were saying, mostly, I want to, sort of police my own yard. Like, I want to take care, like, I'm going to, but I'm going to kind of stay out of other people's business. Where the people, center left and far left, were basically saying, well, we need to engage in activism in order to, for social justice. So it's just it's like the values were the same, but that was sort of the, like, it didn't take very leftmost in order for people to be saying, oh, for social justice, we have to be an activist, where you had to be extreme right in order to want to do that same kind of activism. So I think you're right. Like, I mean, that was one study. Well, actually it was a 3-study paper, but, one paper that sort of says, like, we are kind of forgetting about this, there is a movement on both sides, and we've talked about in other podcasts, and we'll probably talk about again, because he talks about it in this book somewhere, about the book bans we don't even know about, basically.
Right.
The sort of like underground, hidden kinds of things that can happen. So, but anyway, not, as you said, there's a process for saying that a book should be pulled or moved to a different section or something. But there's also a process to request a book, right? So, like,
Yes.
So people should use that.
Yes, if they don't, if there's a book they want the library to have, they should ask. And in most cases, I mean, I don't think I've ever worked anywhere where somebody said, no, we're not going to buy that book. If somebody wanted it, we did our best to get it. I mean, unless it was somehow like not available, but in most cases, libraries do want to work with the people who are using them.
Well, and I think in here he does talk about someone who requested that a book be added, and then I don't think it's not this early in the book, but we will get to that part at some point. That oh yeah, here it is. It's just a few pages away. When I was director of the Douglas County Libraries, a woman requested that we buy a book about the American Holocaust. Then, after she read it, she said she requested that we remove it, or at least move it to a different section. So yeah, sometimes be careful what you wish for, right? So there's a process to fill out to get a book.
Right. And what I remember about that is, if I can find, I highlighted.
I think it's on page like 15 or something. Yeah.
That, again, we had that kind of paternalistic, like, now I see it, and I don't think children should have access to it, right? Even though it's clearly written for children. And he says, many kids are way smarter than adults think they are, and sometimes more level-headed than the adults. They can handle reading a book. And I was thinking about this yesterday. I was watching there's a documentary on Netflix about the TV show Reading Rainbow with LeVar Burton.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was watching that yesterday, and one of the people they interviewed was talking about a book that they had selected for the kids, to read on the show, about a guy who he really loved fish. And so then he woke up one day and he was a fish. It was, very Kafka-esque thing. And, the silly story about what he did, once he became a fish. And somebody said, oh, well, do you think that if we read this, kids will think that if they like something a lot, that they'll turn into it? And so she goes, well, let's go find out, let's ask the kids, like, let's not. And so they read the book to a focus group of children and asked them what they thought. And do you think you could turn into a marshmallow if you really like marshmallows? And she said, like, finally, like, there was just this silence. And then finally one kid spoke up and said, well, this is a story. Yes.
Yeah.
Story. And
yes.
Kids know when they're being read a story, and they know when it's make-believe. They do.
Right. Yeah. And you know what? I mean, make-believe is part of being, that's something that we lose as adults, a little bit. And it's one of the reasons probably we're drawn to like fiction and science fiction or fantasy or mysteries or whatever. I mean, look, we're not hoping that somebody's going to like break into our house and murder someone, it's like, but we read those books all the time. We enjoy being sort of taken away to another place and seeing another perspective. I think that's, like you said, that's a normal process of reading and recognizing that I'm not actually a fish. I'm reading about being a fish. Shocking. By the way, did you know that there were so many different versions of Little Red Riding Hood?
I did. And yeah,
you
I
did?
know
okay.
that there have been there have been challenges to that too. There's one, they mentioned in one case the grandmother drinking wine in this, but there's also another book. We have it in the university library, as a matter of fact, where Little Red Riding Hood has wine in her basket that and that was enough in some cases that they could see a bottle of wine in the basket she's taking to grandma.
You know what? I think that might have been in the one that my mother read to me. Now that I think about it, I mean, it's just I don't know. So, but there's, I mean, this is relevant to what you're talking about here. Is that like the parents are so, it's like they want so much the world to be safe for their kids that they don't even want their kid to read about a world in which there might be a wolf. And I was thinking about in the Boston Globe, so probably also in the New York Times, there was a little editorial piece from a woman who said that she would rather encounter a bear in the woods than encounter a man in the woods. And this story right here kind of reminded me that it's like, where are we in this world? Where you'd rather you're so like, I don't think the world that most men on a walking trail in a woods are as dangerous as most bears. Like statistically, the odds of a bear being dangerous and a man being, I mean, both of those things are low, right? Because bears really don't want to encounter us. And, most people that are also on a walking trail are just walking on a trail, and so, we do, he's talking about sort of parents wanting the clock to stop, to rewind, as if their kid is, going to be safe forever or whatever. But we need to read about possibilities, and we're not going to turn the kids gay or fish or anything like that. So, so I liked this section, and I had never thought about that paternalistic piece. And he's giving an actual like tangible example here of parents saying, oh, I don't want my kid to get hit by a car, so I don't want them to read about cars.
Right. And you know what? There's also one of the things he talks about in the book is these kind of life transitions with kids, right? And that those are the places where parents tend to, understandably, start to worry, right? And as a parent, I experienced this too. Like when my child was born, I determined everywhere that he went, and I determined every single book that I read to him, and everybody that he met. That was my job, right? And he had no say in it. And then, but when he started preschool, then suddenly, oh, I made this friend. I want to have a play date with this person who you don't know, right? Oh, okay. And it was like, oh yeah, I'm not. All I can do is talk to this kid's parents and and see if we can arrange something, right? And then certainly when they go into adolescence and young adulthood, it's a whole other level, right? And even when your kid is very young and like in elementary school and is picking out their own books to read, you can usually read them too. If you
Yes.
like the books are short. So if you can let your kid pick out a book and you can read it too, at least, even if you say, oh, I wouldn't have picked out this book. At least, maybe you could talk to the kid about it because you've read it too. But they get to an age where, if they're voracious readers, there's absolutely no way to keep up.
Mm-hmm.
None. And you can read some of the books some of the time that they're reading, if and if you're concerned, then you need to decide which ones so that you can talk to them. And I know when my child was in high school, everybody's reading Twilight, even middle school. They were reading Twilight, and like, well, why do you let him read that? Like, Because he wants to. He can read whatever he wants. He can read whatever he
And
wants.
be happy they're reading. Be happy, because you know what, middle school and high school, like that's a real void I mean, people aren't reading for pleasure. Young kids aren't
Right.
reading for pleasure
Right.
at those ages, a lot of them. And so there is just this, like, be happy they're reading. Why? Because they're adding to their vocabulary. And so, you know, even if there's nothing else of value in what they're reading, there is that. And
Right.
there's, you know, that is predictive of so many other successes in life. You know, just expanding your word, you know, your word count, you know, is a huge thing, and understanding the language in different ways. And, you know, so is that whole aspect of psychology and development regarding, you know, language. That's, you know, there's value in that book, even if you don't like, even if, I mean, who's to say they liked the book? Maybe they didn't like the book. They, you know, I mean, look, you know, I've read some stuff that, you know, I mean, I've skipped some stuff. I'm just like, well, I'll just read the first sentence of every paragraph and just get through this. I want to find out who done it or whatever. So, but yeah, they can handle reading a book, and they should be, you know,
They can handle reading
exposed
a
to
book.
things. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's a safe way to explore a lot of the difficult topics. It's a very safe way to explore them. Um, and, you know, also, like, I read Twilight, and when everybody else was reading it, I read it. And I loved being swept up in that. And then I tried reading it again like 10 years later. I'm like, why the hell did I like this book? We did.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
read what we need to read at the time, and it
Right.
means something to us.
Yeah.
And, you know,
Songs the same way, right? You know, songs just, you know, strike us for some reason or another. But, and again, like, well, this section sort of ends with the last like 3 pages of like 17 through 20 sort of talk about, you know, this idea that, um, uh, he has this, you know, censorship is most effective when nobody talks about it. And so that's one of the reasons we're doing this, right? We want people to be more aware that this is happening, even if even if it's not outside with, you know, signs and tickets and, you know, on the evening news or whatever, that this is happening. And you know, and we need it to be in the forefront. You know, it says library challenge reports are more like smoke in the forest, that it is going on, you know, sort of behind the scenes. And there may be a like sort of one of those under one of those ground fires or whatever, you know, that's going on, that we can't even see. And so, yeah, I mean, I had never really thought about that before, that we don't even know likely the extent of the censorship problem.
right. I mean, one of the things about the Office of Intellectual Freedom that you mentioned before, like they report on, you know, the most challenged books every year, but that's only on what's been reported to them. And it's a strictly voluntary thing, right? That a library, you know, needs to report to them so that they know. And if the library chooses not to, you know, if they do everything on the DL, then we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then and again, you know, like sort of here, you know, he's giving himself, you know, a little story about this book, Birthday Cake for George Washington. I hadn't ever heard of that, but had you heard of that book as a basically I mean, a book that was canceled, right? It
Yeah.
doesn't even exist anymore.
Yeah, there was no, I don't think I heard about that one. There was another one with a very similar issue. The smiling slave trending, you know, hashtag. There was another book I remember reading about. I can't remember what it was called now, but it was about um, people making this particular dessert through history, and you know, and one of the pieces in the book is some enslaved people creating this dessert for the people they work for, and the same issue that, you know, this mother and daughter were smiling at each other. These two enslaved people were smiling at each other, and I mean, I only read I only read about the issue. I didn't see the
Right.
book. And the same with the one about George Washington's cake, that, it was the same issue, right? A parent and a child making this together and then smiling. I mean, it
What,
seemed to
a
me that
parent and a
like it
child?
was showing, that enslaved people had a range of emotions.
Yeah, guess what?
Right.
There was still parent-child love there, despite being enslaved. I actually think that's I'm sure that that's more than true, right? Like that's part of the issue of families being torn apart and everything. Um, and the interesting thing is that this was written and illustrated by a Black author, a Black illustrator, and they were sort of, it's like America's, first celebrity chefs. Like they're sort of like celebrating in their minds. I'm sure the writers and the illustrator was thinking that they were celebrating a piece of African American history. And this is the same thing like we were talking about. It's like, oh, you don't want people to know that. It's like, oh, I mean, who would that be hurting to maybe read that and have a discussion about it, right? Like this is complicated. No, there was nothing good about slavery, but that doesn't mean that that strong relationships, bonds weren't formed, that people, never found, momentary joy in their interactions with their children or whatever. And it's actually makes slavery all the more sad and tragic that people perhaps didn't have as many of those moments or had to have those moments in very, very, in ugly circumstances or something like that. So anyway, but he says he ran to the local bookstore to see if he could buy a copy, and it was already gone. And so this is now he mentions. So we should probably end with this, but he mentions this. He's saying that doesn't meet the definition of censorship.
Right.
Yeah.
I questioned that too. I mean, I guess some people say, unless it's the government doing it, it's not censorship. But I, I mean, I would say if somebody successfully cancels a book, and you can't buy it anymore, that I disagree with him on that point.
Yeah. Yeah. So that seems like a good place to stop to me. That's up to page 20. So we stopped at what do libraries buy and why? So we'll take up the book at that section. Hope you're reading along with us, and we hope to entertain questions and comments at some point during this process. Thanks.